You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
You're in your apartment alone. Then you hear something. You think, was it just the storm? You realize you're not alone. Your living room is not safe with Unhinged, the new immersive game experience brought to you by Netflix. To make it out alive, you must answer the phone. The question is, when your phone rings, will you answer? Tap the banner to play Unhinged now, only on Netflix.
Whitelaw Reid is a very important newspaper publisher and writer. He's going to be a reporter during the Civil War with some of the best accounts of Civil War battles, one of 3 of the best accounts of Gettysburg. And he is going to be a popular editor. He's going to take over for Horace Greeley at the New York Tribune when Horace Greeley first starts running for president and then dies. And then Whitelaw Reid's going to be really always a radical Republican, if we use that kind of ancient term. Somebody wants to get stuff done. Today we might say progressive legislation. May not fit into all those boxes that today would define a progressive, but that's the way you got to think about him. He's candidate for vice president in 1892, replacing Vice President Levi Morton, who Benjamin Harrison did not want to run with. But he's a fixture in Republican politics, and so when it comes time for an ambassador to Great Britain during Theodore Roosevelt's term, they turn to Whitelaw Reid. And so he is ambassador when he makes a famous speech that isn't as famous anymore as it once was. I mean, he's an older man now. It was in 1906, in the summer, right around the time of July 4th. The Cambridge University contacts the American ambassador to Great Britain, asks him to give a speech on how did the greatest fact in modern history occur? And what does it mean? And what it means is, how did this nation, the United States, come from nothing, as the British people saw it, to being so great? Whitelaw Reid admits that he would have chosen any other subject to give to a British audience, but kind of since you asked for it, he's going to do it in the most polite way, but still describe how the American nation formed. Now, this is some 130 years or so after American independence. So you're getting a more modern viewpoint with now a bustling, growing international power of the United States with the president, bully pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, that's first trying to take some of that international power. For instance, 1906 is right after Theodore Roosevelt negotiates the end to the Russo-Japanese War. Pretty big intervention for an American president on the world scene. I am asked to speak to you on the greatest fact in American history, the rise and development of the United States. Neither George Canning nor his king called this new world into being, and it was not called into being by anybody for the purpose of redressing the balance of the old. As to its most significant and for a long time its leading settlements, it was called into being by Charles I when he pursued separatists, nonconformists, and others in the professed interest of the Church of England. Its growth, meaning America's growth, was checked by the rise of Oliver Cromwell. And while the Protectorate lasted, the Puritan immigration ceased. Charles II revived it. And he and his brother James, by their treatment of the Puritans in England and the Covenanters in Scotland, did more than any other human power to make New England and to make large sections of the United States what they are. I'm going to stop, as I'm going to do throughout this, and comment. I like Whitelaw Reid's point to the British that the purpose of the New World, even though that term was used, certainly maybe it was more used in, say, my age, my schooling, New World versus Old World. But he's saying very clearly, even though we have that title, the New World in America, it's not really how it started. Let's build a place that will perfect on the Old World. It really started because people were chased there and went away. And if you're thinking like, gosh, how does he get off criticizing a king? Well, first of all, he's going to do it a bit in this speech. The British like a nice speech and a little opposition. It's no stranger to it. But also, he's attacking the Stuart kings, which was the family before the Georgian kings. And so he can get away with it a little more. Tudors and Stuarts alike, whatever their intentions, were helpful to the infancy of the new nation. And there, in its fitness, it's possessing enduring monuments to commemorate them. Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Jamestown, and James River. So these are all the various settlements that have those names. So at the beginning of this period, say at the opening of the 17th century, okay, so 1600, and near the close of Queen Elizabeth's long reign, time of Shakespeare, all England was much less than London is now. All England then is much less than London is in 1906. The total population of England was a little over 4 million. A rapid increase was prevented. In fact, a material decrease had been caused by the enormous death of epidemics, which science had not learned to control. Also to constant wars, and to a deplorable waste of human life in the ordinary administration of justice. This is what Whitelaw Reid says. Remember, Whitelaw Reid is a progressive person, and he comes to England as ambassador seeking, still has his progressive ideals. The very king for which the first settlement of Virginia was named, Jamestown, if the declaration of James Balfour shall be trusted, never washed his hands. Prisoners were tortured. Robbers were hung. Witches and religious men whose orthodoxy was not our doxy were burned. For trivial offenses, men and women were whipped or set in the stocks or nailed to their ears to the pillory. Witchcraft was so firmly embedded in the faith of the people that the greatest legal writer of his time, Sir William Blackstone, said, as late as when the American colonies were on the point of revolting, that every nation in the world had borne testimony to it. And to deny it was to deny the revealed word of God. So that's where witchcraft was. This is not, of course, a fair picture of the England from which the colonies went out, though some of the noticeable features are accurately portrayed. You can faintly conceive the limitations of the England of that day, how little it was like the present world. When you add that it knew nothing of the circulation of the blood, nothing of vaccination, nothing of gravitation, of the velocity of light, of the power of steam, of illumination by petroleum, electricity, or communication by fast or cheap mails. It knew nothing of the telegraph or the telephone. It had no newspapers, and its books were few and dear. Yet this England had Magna Carta and parliamentary government, greater and better secured personal liberties than any other country in Europe, and was more jealously watchful of them, and had an inbred respect for law and its officers. And in spite of a degree of illiteracy that now seems surprising, probably led Europe also into diffused intelligence and in a reasoning devotion to religion. Milton was soon to be added to Shakespeare, and the nation was rapidly approaching the great contest in which religious zeal and a passion for civil liberty in almost equal cooperation would precipitate a revolution and execute a king. So he's telling the British story before he gets to the American story. And I think how Whitelaw Reid is kind of winding up the pitch here is saying, this is how great a nation you were. It's going to be a message of, and when you strayed from that a little bit, that's when you created the United States. Meantime, the land in which the new nation was to spring up, a land of rivers and lakes and unbroken forests beyond the Atlantic, lay palpitating with wildlife under summer suns, or blanketed under winter snows, practically unpeopled. The first feeble colony arrived at Jamestown 7 years after the opening of the century. The little company borne by the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock 13 years after that. Now, practically unpeopled. He is ignoring a bit the Indians at this point, but he's going to get to it. And, this is a book or speech made into a book, popular book, from 1906. The only inhabitants at the beginning of the 17th century were the mysterious aborigines whose origin, language, and customs were alike unknown, whose trails through the forests were the only roads, whose patches of Indian corn were the only agriculture, whose clusters of wigwams the only cities. There were, in all, less than 200,000 of them. And he's going to say in the entire area of the eastern United States. I don't believe he's correct here, but in 1906 is what they thought. In limits which now contain the second city in the world, 17 great states, and a total population of over 30 million. That's the East Coast to the Mississippi down to the Gulf of America. At the beginning of the 18th century, this new world had started into full life among the forests, scattered in still feeble colonies, controlled and mainly peopled by Great Britain, lay in isolated settlements across the Atlantic coast. So he's talking about 1700. They had come to include a sprinkling of several northern races, soon to melt wonderfully, this is 1906, into the Anglo-Saxon mold and to renounce other allegiance in order to seek the privileges of British subjects. There were Dutch in New York City. In fact, New York was for about a half century a Dutch city. There were Swedes in Delaware and Germans in Pennsylvania, and to these were added the best that France had to give, in considerable influx of persecuted and exiled Huguenots. There were many sects, too, and these did not melt so readily into one mold. Puritans, most of New England, Baptists in Rhode Island, Episcopalians in New York and Virginia, Presbyterian in New Jersey and the Carolinas, Quakers and Lutherans in Pennsylvania, Roman Catholics in Maryland. All of them insisted on freedom to enjoy their own religion. Many of them had come to an inhabited colony for that purpose. But not all were ready to tolerate other people's religions. At times there had been efforts to impose upon them the established Church of England, but this, they thought, impossible. Religion and education they fostered alike. The church and the schoolhouse went with every fresh pioneer settlement. But many of them left England to escape bishops, others to escape ruling classes. And in their new homes, they would submit neither to a prelacy nor a nobility. They demanded the right of English-born to participate in the government. In the early days of New England, none but church members could vote. As late as 1679, hardly one grown man in Massachusetts out of 5 could vote. Cotton denounced democracy, thinking, no doubt, before Montesquieu, that liberty may be least safe under rule of the mere majority. Nobody dreamed of letting Indians or African Americans, he uses another term, vote, till long after the Revolution. A considerable property qualification was required from every voter. So what he's saying is, we weren't so great at democracy as much as we established little democracies in these colonies. 1 out of 5 people in Massachusetts can vote, and they're not very tolerant of religion like they say. In one way or another, they were ruled by officers from England, and they brought with them the general body of English law. But they had organized parliamentary government in most of the colonies, on the English pattern, with more exact representation and underwritten constitutional arrangements more precise than England ever employed. They looked to England for protection, spoke of it habitually as home, and held themselves under its authority. Yet they already exercised a large measure of local self-government. The old ideas of blind loyalty to the throne had been shaken, first by the Puritan revolt against Charles, and later by the deposition of James. They had twice seen Parliament set aside a king, and it was only a step from this to the belief that not the king, but the representative body, the people chosen by the people, must always be the controlling power of the state. So he's talking about how Americans are looking at the British example, and you've overthrown in our recent memory, in our grandfather's, great-grandfather's time, you've overthrown your kings, 2 of them, Charles I and James, overthrown. You got rid of kings when you didn't like them. You didn't worry about God. I mean, some did. That's his point. But at the same time, he says, there was a personal sense of loyalty to the sovereign, down to the very outset of the American Revolution. Often as strong in America, sometimes stronger, generally more disinterested. Benjamin Franklin wrote privately to his friends at home of George III as the best monarch any nation was ever blessed with. In 1769, when he had to report the refusal by the House of Commons to repeal offensive custom duties, he used even stronger language. I hope nothing that has happened or may happen will diminish in the least our loyalty to our sovereign. I can scarcely conceive of a king of better dispositions or more exemplary virtues. So, even though the Parliament wasn't doing what the American people wanted at the time, Ben Franklin says don't blame it on the king, more or less. 7 years later came the bitter arrangement of the same sovereign in the Declaration of Independence. Bitter arraignment, I should say, of the same sovereign in the Declaration of Independence, and the richest possession of the English crown was lost forever. So what happened? The growth of these colonies, which for a long time was slow, painful, and intermittent, had of late become more rapid. Their population was only about 200,000 when James II was deposed. A quarter of a century later, when the House of Hanover came in, the colonies showed an aggregate of 434,000. By 1754, when the movements for taxing America were about to begin, there was 1.1 million, and here he's going to say free or white settlers. The England, which after a variable, but on the whole unmotherly care of the colonies, was now about to enter that unhappy experience, that experiment of arbitrary taxation. Almost as strong a contrast to the England we have seen in the closing days of Elizabeth as did the 13 colonies of 1754 to the New World before Jamestown and Plymouth. In numbers it had grown from 4 millions to perhaps 10. In government it had passed from Essex to Newcastle, Bute. Landmarks on that long road were a civil war, a commonwealth, a restoration, more discontent, a deposition, the choice of a new sovereign from abroad. That's going to be William of Orange, who's technically the Dutch sovereign who comes over and becomes King of England. Sovereign from abroad, and enormously increased power in Parliament. And now at another royalist reaction with revival of all old prerogatives through parliamentary methods by purchase majorities, was to precipitate a crisis in the American possessions. So what he's saying is, like, you all had a lot of freedom here. Englishmen had a lot of rights. But a sovereign who couldn't get what he wanted through absolute power anymore because you have a constitutional monarchy, and he didn't contest that directly, was getting what he wanted through favoritism to certain members of Parliament to get what he wants. And that has always been, and I'm sure we'll get into it more here, the criticism of Lord North. Too close to King George. Meantime, the nation had enjoyed an enormous extension of commerce beginning with the Revolution in 1688 and prospered on colonial trade, won glory in foreign wars. Of its entire exports, this is England, 1/4 was taken by its colonies in America. Under the inspiring guidance of Chatham, the Prime Minister, England was rapidly coming to the front in both hemispheres. But one thing was forgotten. While the people that elected their sovereign by Parliament had thus made their own representatives supreme, few realized that Americans could learn the lesson. It scarcely entered many English minds that those dependent poor relations might in their turn demand an equal authority for their representatives. Ministers at this date were indeed curiously ignorant of the colonies they governed. Distance, inattention, and misinformation cooperated to produce political blindness. His own governors, one English historian said, by their reports to him, wrote King George out of America. To them, and so easily enough to him, it seemed a natural thing that the colonists should be content to buy everything from England. And yet these uneasy colonists had given splendid proof of their devotion. Unaided, they had captured Louisbourg, then the French stronghold in America, for the British crown. They had responded to Pitt's calls involving men and money, this is the French and Indian War, far beyond reasonable expectations. Nearly 2/3 of Abercrombie's force on Lake George had been sent from New England, New York, and New Jersey. Another year, Connecticut had sent 5,000 men under arms to support the British campaign, and Massachusetts 7,000. When disasters came, the feeble colonists strained afresh their resources. Massachusetts sent 1 in 6 of all its inhabitants capable of bearing arms, and Connecticut an equal or greater number. While the war lasted that expelled the French from the Great Lakes and from the Ohio, New Jersey taxed herself at the rate of £1 per head for every inhabitant. Massachusetts levied on personal incomes at the rate of 13 shillings and 4 to the pound. Also land taxes, poll taxes, and even colonial stamp taxes. At this period, the colonies have been developing in America for a century and a half. England might have taken pride in this. The colonists were in the main curiously orderly and curiously law-abiding. They were temperate, moral, and generally religious. The world had never seen such a widely scattered rural community, with a more general diffusion of intelligence and a smaller percentage of illiteracy. Everybody worked and enjoyed the fruits of his labor. There were no rich and comparatively few poor. Okay, now, I think you're going to read in the works of other historians a different sense of that from Whitelaw Reid. They had great disparity between, say, rich merchants in Philadelphia and Boston, and poor farmers, and also between, say, various master trades and apprentices in the same. Nonetheless, there was no governing class. All took part in government. And the man who had been called to the public service at the end dropped back naturally into his position. Instead of making laws, might again be making shoes. There were no palaces. But away from the frontier settlements, there were very few hovels. And according to the standard of the times, the mass of the population was probably as comfortably housed as in England, with better surroundings. Here's what Turgot, the Frenchman, said when he visits in 1750. Vast regions of America. Equality keeps them from both luxury and want, and preserves to them the purity and simplicity with freedom. Europe herself will find here the perfection of her political societies, and the surest support of her well-being. But Turgot added, in words that might have borne a profitable warning, in the country across the Channel, the Frenchman said, "But colonies are like fruits, which cling to the tree only till they ripen." How that predicted end was hastened with such an English people as we have been describing may now be seen in the events of the next 20 years. So this is what, in Whitelaw's speech to Cambridge University, members of the British government present, the very elite people present, listening to the American ambassador tell them why America separated. You blew it in 20 years. You built it in a century and a half, and you blew it in 20 years. In 1750, the construction of more iron mills in the American colonies was forbidden. A lot of people forget about this. The Iron Act. Yeah, we simply couldn't produce one of the world's most important resources at that time. So that there might be more demand for English product. While the liberty to manufacture was thus hampered, the liberty to import slaves, under the guise of a right to trade between the Barbary Coast and the Cape of Good Hope, was in the same year extended to all subjects of the King of England. In 1753, a new governor was instructed to withhold from the New York Assembly the right it had always exercised of considering and voting annually the allowances for the support of the government and of examining the accounts. So I always bring this up to people that Whitelaw Reid is bringing up to his English audience. That if you want to understand the revolution, a lot of people say, like, why did you fight? It's just over some taxes or some tea or silly things like that. It's like, no, it's this control that at any time could have been revoked. Yeah, governors being sent from a faraway island and would have new powers. This is only 20 years before a revolution. He just gave a new one to the governor of New York, that it's not going to be the assembly, the elected people anymore that are going to do their budget. The next year, the colonies were required to contribute to a general fund, and Halifax, by the king's command, proposed an American Union for that purpose, with a Congress of one commissioner for each colony to adjust the quotas. Ominous suggestion. Ben Franklin, had already favored the Union, but with modifications. He would have no taxation by Parliament unless with ample representation in that body, and legislation on an equal basis for all. A year after, in 1756, the British commander-in-chief was reinforcing the recommendation of various royal governors for an act of Parliament, levying a stamp duty, also a poll tax, and an excise tax on all colonies for a general fund. If any colony failed to pay, there would be royal warrants of imprisonment. He was succeeded the same year by Loudon, who, under a commission prepared by Chancellor Hardwicke, was instructed to make the colonial assemblies distinctly and precisely understand that the king required of them a general fund to be issued and applied, as the commander-in-chief should direct, and likewise pay for the quarter of the soldiers. When an attempt was made, under this, to billet officers of the army upon New York City, the mayor objected that it was contrary to the laws of England, contrary to the privileges of Englishmen and common law. Free quarters are everywhere usual, replied the commander-in-chief. I assert it on my honor, which is the highest evidence you require. God damn my blood! If you do not billet my officers upon free quarters this day, I'll order here all the troops in North America under my command, billet them all upon the city myself. So he's being a bit of a tyrant there, and this is 20 years before a revolution. New York submitted, unwillingly enough, and soon after Philadelphia, under similar compulsion, all did the same. While troops were billeted in the cities, the frontiers were left open to the Indians and the French. With such conditions prevailing in America, George III came to the throne October 1760. It took scarcely 14 years to precipitate a crisis. Early in 1761, the restrictions in the Acts of Trade were brought to the court in Boston, and James Otis appeared to resist the call upon all executive officers and subjects of the colony to assist in their enforcement. Okay, let's talk a bit about James Otis. Important and somewhat forgotten figure. But he's the one that's supposed to be collecting taxes in Massachusetts, and he refuses. His arguments were cogent, but what startled alike the court and the community was the defiant challenge he flung at the feet of the judges. I will sacrifice everything, he said, to the sacred cause of this country, in opposition to a kind of power, the exercise of which cost one king of England his head and another his throne. The court, staggered for the moment, postponed a decision, and the Chief Justice wrote to England. Meantime, the fiery orator was elected to the Assembly, and the next year we find him declaring that no taxes could be arbitrarily levied without the consent of the legislative body. That was the advantage of being an Englishman rather than a Frenchman. And for the colonists, he held that the rights of a colonial assembly were the same as were those of the House of Commons for residents of England. Now, that's important to state what Otis is stating. I mean, it's revolutionary talk. 10 years before anybody's going to be talking about Lexington and Concord. Revolutionary talk. Because what he means is, we care in the colonies as much for our assemblies as you do your parliament. And that's important because in England, if the king were to do something to the parliament, there would be an absolute right that almost everyone would recognize after the Glorious Revolution, say, after William, that you have the right to revolt. To this day, the king has to ask permission to enter the Commons. That's what he's saying he wants for Massachusetts Assembly. By the first day of the next year, 1763, it was admitted that the plans of the ministry included the permanent quartering of 20 battalions on the colonies after the peace in Europe. And the colonies themselves would bear the expense of these soldiers. And it goes farther, contemplating that the withdrawal of the colonial charters and the imposition of a uniform system of government throughout the colonies. This goes on for about 2 years, he describes, and then finally, the Stamp Act is passed by the Parliament in February 1765.
And we're live from the living room as Doug eyes up the matchday spread. He's reaching for the buffalo wing. Perfect! Hang on, what's this? Oh, he's gone for a can of Pepsi too! Incredible! What a finish! Sensational combination! Look at the delight on his face. There's no doubt about it. It just tastes better. Match days deserve Pepsi. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a pack of Pepsi Zero Sugar for today's match. It's poetry in motion.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Ordena el FIFA World Cup Meal Deal en McDonald's. Llévatelo con un McChicken por $8 o con un McDouble por $9. Incluye papitas pequeñas, refresco, 4 McNuggets y un vaso coleccionable. Precios y participación pueden variar por tiempo limitado hasta agotar existencias. No disponible con McDelivery.
The first effect of the Stamp Act was an outburst of universal opposition and a concerted movement to paralyze its enforcement, extorting the resignation of every stamp officer. The next, even more ominous effect was the assemblage in New York of a Congress containing duly authorized representatives of nearly all the colonies. Against the opposition, thus concentrated, the act was powerless. Scarcely a stamp, and these were stamps to be put on every newspaper, every legal document, scarcely a stamp was sold. And after setting all America in a flame, the Stamp Act was repealed, 13 months after it had been passed. Then, Whitelaw Reid says, then the repeal of the Stamp Act. 1766. This was the moment when the hands of the clock could have been turned back. But the goodwill aroused in America by the repeal was wasted. 16 months later, the hour had struck, and the ministers carried through Parliament a bill essentially decreeing the American Revolution. It was a bill reviving the effort to tax the colonists by a distant parliament in which they were not represented, for purposes about which they had not been consulted. The new bill acted as if nothing had happened. The colonists instantly prepared to resist. Otis and the other leaders counseled moderation now, but submission wasn't possible. By a common impulse, they decided on non-intercourse as the effective answer in an attempt to collect taxes on goods they were expected to buy. In New England, in New York, in Pennsylvania, that answer cost British merchants, this is a boycott, a reduction of over 2/3 in the sale of the taxed articles in a single year. The movement spread until 1770. It included all the colonies. And as might have been foreseen, it gave a wonderful stimulus to home manufacturers. Within a single year, a single town in Massachusetts made 80,000 pairs of women's shoes and was selling them throughout the colonies. The ministry resentfully talked of transporting leading men from America to England to be tried for treason under an old statute of Henry VIII. Then it sent more troops. Lord North, speaking for the ministry and the king, said, "America must fear you before she can love you. I am against repealing the last act of Parliament. securing to us a revenue out of America. I will never think of repealing it until I see an America prostrate at my feet. That's Lord North. One of the songs of the day, which were often, tavern songs, but sometimes poetry, was soon sung freely in the streets of Boston. Come join, hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. To die we can bear, but to serve we disdain. For shame is to freedom more dreadful than pain. In freedom we're born, in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, boys, steady. Not as slaves, but as freemen. Our money we'll give. The government demanded that a Massachusetts legislature should rescind its acts and dissolve the legislature when it refused to do so. The legislative functions of New York had already been suspended. One colonist wrote, "We cannot believe they will draw the sword on their own children, but if they do, our blood is more at the service. Our blood is more at their service than our liberties." Once again, the ministry wavered in a course that threatened such storms, and in March 1770 it repealed all its taxes on America, but kept one, that on tea. The non-importation agreements relaxed. New York, which had held to them more firmly than any of the associate colonies, wearied of seeing its imports fall of 5 parts out of 6, while the others profited by its abstinence, and so promoted a joint movement for resuming trade in everything but tea. But by August 1770, London was rejoicing at the return of American orders, business, and somewhat misconstruing them. So, you see, they're relaxing a little bit in 1770. You also see a bit there where Whitelaw Reid's talking about how New York got a little more benefit from trade. Didn't like seeing the other colonies open to trade. And so, actually, that's kind of the foundation for it being a little more loyalist. But as if heaven had ordained that every opportunity should be thrown away, a month later, the fortress commanding Boston, built and maintained by that colony to be garrisoned, as the charter guaranteed by its militia under the command of its governor, the Massachusetts governor, was taken over by regular British troops, and the harbor of Boston made the rendezvous of all ships stationed in North America. The answer of Massachusetts to this martial law was to commission Benjamin Franklin in London to represent it and state its grievances. Now events are moving in restless currents, and even that benign messenger of peace could not check them. On a paltry question of exempting its commissioners of customs from taxation on their salaries, the governor came in conflict with the Massachusetts Assembly and claimed for the crown an unheard-of power. A few months later, South Carolina was aggrieved at having been induced to establish fixed salaries for judges, if made permanent officials, only to have their own judges forthwith removed, and an Irishman, a Scotchman, and a Welshman sent over to take these permanent places as judges in South Carolina. Virginia fell outraged at having its efforts to restrict the slave trade thwarted by an instruction by the governor upon pain of the highest displeasure to assent to no law by which the importation of slaves should be in any respect prohibited or obstructed. So, you will hear a lot, deservedly so, about Britain's later role in abolishing the slave trade before America did. But this early part is not as well known and is often brought up. Jefferson tries to put it into the Declaration of Independence initially as one of the grievances that, they try to restrict at least the trade of slaves, and the British refuse. An appeal was taken to the throne and reached England just as Lord Mansfield has decided that a slave becomes free the moment he touches English soil. But not even that could secure a hearing for the Virginia appeal, or English consent to the Virginia law to restrict the trade in slaves. His Majesty's ship Gaspee needlessly exasperated the Rhode Islanders by taking livestock, detaining vessels, and making illegal seizures of goods. The Chief Justice gave an opinion against these acts. The admiral overruled the Chief Justice and said if the people of Newport attempted to rescue any vessel, he would hang them as pirates. Thereupon, when the Gaspee, pursuing the Providence packet, ran aground, a few men from Providence and Bristol boarded her, overpowered the offensive lieutenant and his crew, set them ashore, and burned the vessel to the water's edge. Commissioners were ordered to find the offenders and send them to England for trial. The Chief Justice refused to permit apprehensions for transportation beyond seas. After that, it was proposed to take away the charter of the Rhode Island colony. Thus, every month seemed to add to the popular ferment and to spread it from one colony to another. Meantime, what had it all been worth? During the progress of the Gaspee business, the Stamp Office found that it spent £12,000 in America to get a revenue of $1,500. That was what the stamp tax was worth. Ships and soldiers employed to enforce the law taxing tea had cost enormously, and the East India Company had lost the sale of £500,000 worth of tea per year, while the total revenue from the tax amounted to only £85. That was what the tea tax was worth, £85 for loss of $500,000. So at last the East India Company begged for relief and asked leave to export to America free of all duties. Lord North preferred another way. He held to tax in America, but gave the company a drawback on such export of all the import duties it had paid. The company was warned that this meant trouble, but Lord North would listen to no objections. He said he meant to try the question with America. And so it was tried. The tea was sent to Boston. It was sent to New York, to Philadelphia, and Charleston. Boston threw it into the harbor. 16th December, 1773. New York was ready to do the same, but adverse winds kept the ship away. Philadelphia, through a town meeting of 5,000 men, persuaded the consignee to resign, and the captain to take a ship and go back to London. Charleston also persuaded the consignee to resign, and there was nobody to pay the duty or sell the tea. And so it wasn't thrown into the water, but in Charleston it rotted on the ships where it was stored. Finally, when a tea ship last reached New York 4 months after the Boston occurrence, it was sent back the next day, while 18 chests of tea found in another vessel were merely thrown into the bay. Lord North's experiment of trying us was complete, and a substantial union of the colonies was revealed. Franklin had been furnished with certain letters by the governor and lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, quite at variance with their public professions, and evidently designed to foment existing difficulties and secretly provoke the ministry to take more stringent measures against the colony. So he's seeing these letters that the governors of these colonies are writing, and it's not what they're saying in public in the American colonies. So he thinks it's right to send those letters to the Speaker of the Assembly. Ultimately, though contrary to his expectation, they became public and naturally aroused fierce resentments against the American-born officers, who were thus found deceiving and underhandedly conspiring against their own countrymen and bringing the military occupation upon them. The Assembly petitioned the king for removal of the exposed governor and lieutenant governor, and Franklin was instructed to present the petition. Lord Dartmouth received it with his usual courtesy, but when it was referred to the Privy Council for a hearing, the whole case went off, not on the obvious guilt of the double-dealing officials, but on the alleged misconduct of Franklin. That's right, Franklin's going to be hauled into the Privy Council and embarrassed, one of the worst moments of his life. Franklin, now venerable and distinguished throughout Europe, was kept standing at the bar, while members insulted and lampooned him for stealing or betraying private correspondence. This from a ministry that habitually did the same thing. The petition, which all men knew to be true, was dismissed as groundless, vexatious, and scandalous. The work, to which every step of the ministry had for years been trending, was nearly finished. In March 1774, Lord North carried through a Parliament a bill closing the port of Boston till the tea was paid for, and till the king should be satisfied the good conduct of the city. Burke and Fox, these are American-supporting members of Parliament. Burke and Fox made the debate memorable and splendid, and Lord Dartmouth showed signs of the desire to conciliate, always gratefully remembered in his relation to the colonies. But the same Lord Mansfield who had decided that a slave could not exist on English soil, while the ministry he supported was refusing to let Virginia limit the slave trade, now encouraged that ministry to the uttermost, exclaiming, "The sword is drawn, and you must throw away the scabbard. Pass this act, and you will be across the Rubicon." He told the truth more exactly than he knew. General Gage, military commander in all of North America, and now made the civil governor of Massachusetts, was sent out with 4 more regiments to close the port, quarter troops in Boston, and bring the ringleaders in the late disturbances to punishment for high treason, also to abolish town meetings, and appoint and remove sheriffs at his pleasure. If the colony had already been conquered, harder usage would scarcely have been proposed, but General Gage thought the conquest easy. He assured the king that the people of the Massachusetts would be lions, whilst we are lambs. But if we take the resolute part, they will undoubtedly prove very weak. This time the answer of America was a Continental Congress. This is 1774. New York proposed it through her Sons of Liberty. Virginia burgesses, after being dissolved by the government, held a meeting elsewhere, proposed it, and asked Massachusetts to appoint a time and place of meeting. General Gage, hearing what was on foot, sent to dissolve the Massachusetts Assembly, but found the door locked. It was not opened until 5 delegates had been appointed to attend a Continental Congress in Philadelphia, about 5 months after Parliament had passed the Boston Port Bill. So what Whitelaw Reid is saying essentially is you want to know how the U.S. was created, and it's created from your mistakes, from your ministry, from you're not going with the better angels of your nature, so to speak. A convention of towns in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, resolved that a king who violates the chartered rights of his people forfeits their allegiance, and it refused obedience to any recent acts of Parliament. The Continental Congress now sends Paul Revere to bear to Boston their warm approval of the Suffolk County resolutions. General Gage now undertakes to arrest Samuel Adams and Hancock. They are conspicuous leaders in this policy. He wants to transport them to England for trial. He sends a body of regular troops to do it, under the cover of night. Warren starts Paul Revere on his midnight ride ahead of the British troops to give them the alarm. At Lexington, these troops came upon a body of Minutemen, commanded by the grandfather of Theodore Parker, ordered them to disperse. And as they still stood, grim but undemonstrative, fired upon them. 8 fell, and 10 more were wounded. Concord followed about an hour or 2 later. The embattled farmers fired the shot heard round the world, and the war was begun. Franklin, seeing that there was no more help in London, was already upon the ocean, returning to take his place with his own people. There I've finished the story. What remains is merely the fighting, the ghastly civil war between Britain and her sons. So you're noticing that one thing that Whitelaw Reid is not going to do is give an explanation to the British of why the Americans won that has anything to do with where Washington moved his troops, or the Battle of Trenton, or the Battle of Brandywine, or anything like this. He's ignoring the fighting, and he goes right to the contest was not really between the British people and their colonizing sons, and, no matter of fact, both profited by the result. Even the fighting was largely between Americans and Hessians. The ministry hired soldiers to carry on its war because Great Britain did not readily furnish them. That's an interesting point to make. It's something that I've made in some of my discussions about the Revolutionary War. And it's an argument. It's a counter-argument sometimes if people say, like, oh, you Americans, you couldn't win without France. And, well, Britain never would have had even a chance of winning the contest without its Hessian allies. I mean, it needed those Hessian boots on the ground to fight in most battles. They fought in almost every battle in the Revolutionary War on the British side. That being said, it wasn't like there were no British soldiers The actual contest, Whitelaw Reid says, was between what are now universally recognized as Anglo-Saxon principles of government and a movement under the king of the day that would have set England back to the times of Charles I. The colonists were inspired by the Protestant Reformation and by the Magna Carta. The intellectual emancipation that came from the one and the fervor for personal rights that came from the other reached their natural development, easier and quicker, amid the untrammeled surroundings of a new world. Their triumph checked a reaction in England, and the British government of the 19th century was distinctly more advantageous to the people, more glorious for the nation, and a greater force for good to Europe and the world because of this struggle with the colonists in the last quarter of the 18th. Yeah, you can argue this. So what Whitelaw Reid is essentially saying is, you had a king, and that's George III. He's the enemy here, guys. Not modern England, not who I'm talking to, not a lot of people in Britain at the time. But this George III that was trying to turn things back to a more king-rooted government that Charles I, the Stuarts, would have had. And the Britain that occurred after the American Revolution was a better one. Now he says, to follow the effects of the rise of the United States, remember he's talking in 1906, the United States is the growth engine of the world, farther now is besides my present purpose. That its echo was first heard amid the crashing of old institutions in the French Revolution cannot be doubted. It was certainly a factor in the subsequent rapid extension of popular rights throughout Europe. As it stimulated liberty by its political development, so it stimulated material welfare by its inventions, its products, and its opportunities. We can scarcely conceive now of a world without American food and American cotton, without the American applications of steam and electricity, or without the American outlet for superfluous energy and superfluous population. The people of the new nation held as firmly as they had while colonists that there should be no taxation without representation, and that they were sometime in doubt as to whether there should be any representation without taxation. In several states, ownership of a freehold of 50 acres or a town lot was necessary. In scarcely any could the suffrage be exercised without a return of considerable taxable property, real or personal. A reasonable degree of intelligence was also exacted, and the illiterate were excluded from voting. Far few offices than now were elective. The judges were generally appointed, sometimes for 7 years, sometimes forever, during good behavior. Even the delegates to the Continental Congress were chosen not by the people, but by the state legislatures. There is no hindrance, though, in learning trades, no limit to the hours of labor, no power to keep a man from working if he wanted to work and found work. The colonist would have accepted unreservedly those golden words, which Clemenceau lately thrilled the French Chamber of Deputies. But while accepting them, he would have wondered why he thought it necessary to say so obvious a thing. And here's what Clemenceau said. And what Clemenceau said, the French premier, is that I believe every person who needs to work and can find work has the right to work. I believe that society and the public authorities have the duty to ensure that this right can be exercised. He says it in French. And what Whitelaw Reid is saying, that Americans would accept that, but wondered why you would even think it's necessary to say that, because in the America of 1906, there's no restriction on working. Now, listen, I mean, Whitelaw Reid, progressive in that traditional sense, maybe not progressive in 2026 sense, and, you know, we're talking about, there's definitely a lot between having the right to work and finding that work and having it be good pay. But nonetheless, he makes this comment. The result of it all is the marvel of modern history. It was one of your own prelates and scholars who said of it, time's noblest offspring is the last. What in the final analysis made the success? For who shall say the splendid will survive, if what made it be lost? Well, first of all, it was made and most successes are by character. America in the making was intelligent, moral, religious, and religiously devoted to the education of children. It was desperately earnest. It was alert and industrious, almost without a class that only amuses itself. It was passionately attached to the personal rights of Englishmen. It had an inborn respect for authority and reverence for law. Its ancestors had been used to representative institutions for centuries, and it was thoroughly trained in parliamentary government. And the next success was made by circumstance. The inefficient were sifted out. Those left were picked class. They were alone in a wild and fertile, and as it seemed, boundless land. Opportunities opened on every hand. The time, like the climate, was electric, and there was an absolute freedom for individual initiative. It is not sure that such a success could be won now. It is not sure that such a government, as they found it, could be carried on now, if that character were materially changed. Is it even sure that success could be maintained if those circumstances were materially altered, and particularly if that fecund freedom of individual initiative should be destroyed by the collectivist or socialist tendencies of the times? But such a catastrophe is not to be thought of, whatever may be the wild speculations of the hour, whatever the temporary variations from the historic course. No vessel that carries the English-speaking races has lost its chart. On none has the compass gone hopelessly astray. The old headlights still burn. Inspired by the same traditions, led by the same instincts, these races in either hemisphere, in whatever zone, on whatever continent or island, will surely in the end hold fast to the ancient characteristics of a strong free people, and so keep secure their place in the van of human progress. There you go, Whitelaw Reid, The Greatest Fact in Modern History, delivered to Cambridge and then made a little book, a nice little book, The Greatest Fact in Modern History, in gilded letters. I have a copy of it, very popular speech. And although some of its tenets seem a little antiquated to us, and it's not like we don't see them in today's politics, attacks on collectivism and everything like that. I pointed out a few times in his speech where, it may not be totally factual what he's saying, but the general gist of it is there. Like, you lost the Americans because you gave up on your own values, Britain. And don't do it again is kind of the message. 1906, America at this time is kind of a brick nation, growing nation. And even though it may not have as much money yet, that's going to happen after World War II. It's the envy of the world in terms of its growth rate and its population growth and all of the opportunities and things like that. You have many British people moving to America to seek out opportunities. Thanks for listening. Happy July 4th.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.